I still had myself muted. Ha. Welcome, everyone, to the most recent episode of The Fog and the Whirlwind at episode 103 today. Wanted to begin, as we always do, with our passage of the week, which is in Ephesians. Ephesians 6:12 says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." And again, that is Ephesians 6:12. You know, it's easy to feel like the progressive person or the liberal person in front of you is the enemy. And you're not exactly wrong in thinking that. But ultimately, it's not about this person who's in a fleshly body or us that's in a fleshly body. We are part of something bigger. Yes, we are in our fleshly bodies for this time, but we have spiritual life in Christ. That's why we care so much about the plight of this world and why we don't want our enemy to destroy it. The beautiful creation, the beautiful order that God has set up. And that's one of the reasons why we get so passionate about this. We want this disorder, this chaos, this evil to stop. But it's important to remember that it's not just the government agencies, for example, the Department of Defense trying to start more wars, military industrial complex, even people like George Soros. That's who they are on the outside, but who they are on the inside is what we're really fighting against. Spiritual forces. They are pawns in the game of an evil one. And we oppose that. We are on the side of good. We are on the side of righteousness. And why? It's not because we figured out our way there. We used logic and reason to get our way there. Let's be clear. It's because our God revealed himself to us. We were just as lost. We were walking in darkness. Everything before our eyes was black. We did not know our left hand from our right. But our Lord came to us and saved us. And we are eternally grateful, literally, for his sacrifice. We will be able to thank him in paradise one day. And I'm very thankful for his sacrifice for us. And so it's important to remember that this is a fight between light and darkness. This is a term appropriated by our enemies. If you remember, Joe Biden would say, he'd shamble before a microphone and say, "We got to remember, we're going to go through a long, dark winter." Yeah, that's it. And, people are having to turn on the teleprompter so he can know the right words to say. And he would say, "This is a fight between light and darkness." He used this kind of rhetoric all the time. Satan himself was an angel of light, disguised the dark part of him, disguised the evil part of him as something light and pleasant to look at and good. And unfortunately, these enemies on this planet do the same thing. They will try to deceive you if they can. That's an important thing to note. That's where discernment comes in. That's why the Bible is so important too. We must read the word to know truth from lies. Okay, let's go ahead and get into the content of this episode. But before we do that, some very quick announcements. The fogandwhirlwind.substack.com/subscribe is the best way to find me still. You may have noticed that there's been some branding issues. I've been trying to use, I'm kind of naturally creative. I've been trying to use some different creative outlets to rebrand the show. I've settled on a pretty good one. I like a lot of that old-timey stuff, whether it be colonial stuff whether it be aristocrats in England or whether it be old-timey stuff from the golden age of piracy. And so you see here this new profile picture that I have, and that's subject to change. It may change soon. Some notes on this episode. Most of it is going to be completely understood by audio. I'm not really going to show anything up on screen. If you want to see anything on screen, you can just come over to YouTube, Rumble, or Odyssey. But I'm trying to keep in mind those people who are listening to this on audio, so I really want to keep you guys in mind and not do anything on screen that you guys can't understand. Or if I do, alternatively, I will describe for you what's going on. So I mean, you can kind of see this when I played the video from John Hagee in my dispensationalism versus amillennialism video, the part 1, and he made the ridiculous statements that he made. You didn't really need to see that on screen. I mean, you can now if you want to go into the video and watch it, but you can hear it just fine. So that shouldn't be a problem. There shouldn't be any formatting issues, but if there are, just let me know. It's pretty easy. Okay, guys, let's get into something I've been very excited to talk to you about. This is a review and a discussion about reactionary thought in general, but a review more specifically of The Reactionary Mind, subtitled Why Conservative Isn't Enough, by Michael Warren Davis. Enjoy. An important thing to establish first is some of what these terms mean. So what does it mean to be a reactionary? Well, we got to dive in even deeper than that. What does it mean to be on the left, and what does it mean to be on the right? Now, I'm going to have to make some distinctions here because this is a little bit hard. So for those of you watching, I have an image of a reactionary on the screen. But for those of you listening, you can follow along. When it comes to the ideas of left and right, it's complicated because the weird thing about the right wing in America is that a lot of the ideas of limited government and such are able to be tied back to Enlightenment principles, Enlightenment thinking, this idea that humanity was in darkness, that humanity was going through this time of superstition and just ignorance, and that people weren't educated and didn't know what way to go and how to act. And then Enlightenment came around. These types of philosophers, sorry for getting the words tangled, came along and they changed everything. They were able to, with their wit and wisdom, show us what we needed to do. This is why, rather than calling it the early Middle Ages, and then I guess they call it the second Middle Ages, or maybe they just call it Middle Ages. I don't remember the exact term. And then late Middle Ages, they prefer to refer to the first section as the Dark Ages. This idea that we were in darkness. And that's part of this book that I'm reviewing. Is he contends, Michael Warren Davis contends, that the Dark Ages were not so dark, that the Enlightenment was a gigantic problem. He also would contend that the Reformation was a problem, that it got away from tradition, which is the Catholic Church. And he makes that case, and I can understand the argument without agreeing with it. I don't. But to go back to Enlightenment thinking and things like that, whenever the French Revolution came along, which in many ways, arguably, there are tiny little parts of the American Revolution that were less than ideal, of course. I really look up to these men and admire many ways that they thought, particularly George Washington. That man seemed to understand liberty and authority in a very measured way. I also think that Alexander Hamilton had a lot of things worth thinking about and saying. And there, Jefferson had his place as well. He was more of a deist. There were whole sections of the Bible that he cut out. I don't, of course, like that, but the man was nevertheless intellectual. But one thing to finally get back to what I'm saying and to clarify why I'm kind of going all over the place, I promise you it's relevant, is in the French Revolution, that's where the terms left and right came from. Those who sat to the right of the king were those who were traditionalists, they were monarchists, they believed in hierarchy. And those who sat on the left were liberals, really. I mean, I don't mean liberal by like, oh, FDR, no, or Obama. No, I mean liberal in the sense of capital L liberal. These people would have agreed with John Locke. These people would have cited the founding fathers of this country, of the United States of America. But of course, they took it in a more extreme, in a way, if you will, more populist direction, but with none of the good sides of populism, more of the evil sides of populism, which is weird because populism and liberalism are not necessarily the same thing. They can ally in certain ways. In the French Revolution, they certainly did. But those who sat on the left were the liberals. They were egalitarian. They wanted everything to change. They wanted so-called equality of opportunity. And then some of them then expanded on that and turned it into equality of outcome as well. They actually went either anarchist or communist. This is when we see the origin of this kind of thought. So that's where the terms left and right came from. Reactionaries were on the right. They wanted to uphold tradition and monarchy, hierarchy, and virtue. The church, most of them were very religious as well. There was a deist, if not straight out agnostic streak that was in the French Revolution. There was people that just outright rejected religion privately, although publicly they probably wouldn't have said so because it was not popular to do so. It is now. It's very popular to be an agnostic or spiritual but not Christian, or atheist. That's kind of the popular thing right now. It's actually very countercultural to be hardcore Christian in a good way, and that's, of course, y'all know where I stand on Christianity. I begin each episode with a passage of the week for a reason. He is the reason we do anything that we do. So that's the concept of left and right. I think that it's also important to make the distinction. I mentioned the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, as we call it here in the States. I'll cover it at some point in greater nuance. I confess I want to do a deeper study of it because Thomas Hutchinson does a really interesting debunking or refutation of the Declaration of Independence, and I don't agree particularly with it. I think that there's some things worth considering, but the thing that I like about the founders is that they were white Christian men, and in order to vote, you had to be a Christian man, member of the church, and you had to own land, right? And that's actually very right-wing. That's not really a liberal or leftist thing. They did not really want either equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. Per se, they did want rights for men, but they were not Democrats, large D, or even small d, where like they wanted democracy. That wasn't really what they wanted. They wanted this elite class of people, these members of the church, to own land and rule this country. And so now it's important to distinguish, because of this, it's important to note that liberalism is not all the same. There is sort of this centrist, but I would argue left liberalism, which is really what we see now. Whenever someone calls himself a progressive or a liberal, very few progressives are actually progressive. Because if you're a progressive, you're basically very close to being a communist. Most of the time when someone says, I'm progressive, you actually nail them down on things like the economy and such, and they really are neoliberals LARPing as progressives. There's a lot of fake people like that. I mean, you hear this with people like Destiny, Stephen Bonnell has called himself progressive, but then whenever you hear him debate like Richard Wolff, who's a Marxist, it becomes very clear he's very capitalist, he's a liberal. He's also had disagreements with the Young Turks. and Hassan Piker over it. And look, I'm not advocating for communism at all. I'm very anti-communist. But I'm just saying that there's a lot of people that call themselves progressives that aren't. They're neoliberals. So you've got these liberals that, yeah, I think really Stephen Bonnell would be a good example of like a left liberal. Another one, this is another good example. Oh man, his name just left my mind. Ben Burgess. I would think of him as well. And in ways, he may be more progressive on economics, but in many ways, he's always talking about democracy, and he's very socially liberal. I would probably call him a left liberal, and so yeah, there's a lot of people that call themselves that. But an example of a true progressive would be like Cenk Uygur or maybe Kyle Kalinske. So you've got that kind of liberalism. Then you've got right liberalism, which to me there's none better than Hans Hermann Hoppe. And he has books. I own his books. I've got two of them. And he's someone who talks about social conservatism, but also being fiscally libertarian and hands off and property rights. And I don't really have a particular problem with that. I think that there's a very nuanced conversation. I believe that private property is a good thing. I do believe that, for example, charging interest should be outlawed. I think that it's not biblical and does more harm than good. I do. And there's a huge problem with debt, but I've been also clear with the sense of credit card debt. I think that the chips should basically fall where they are. The people just need to avoid credit card debt like they avoid the plague or avoid cigarettes. I like how Dave Ramsey says that credit cards are the cigarette of the financial world. And I'm perfectly fine with someone wanting to smoke cigarettes. I am. I'm pretty much in that sense with tobacco. With drugs, it's a little bit different. But with alcohol and tobacco, I'm very tolerant of basically living and letting that these things are taxed and regulated. And in terms of tax, I don't really care about being taxed. The government has too much money as it is. But they're regulated and hopefully regulated to the point where we know what's going into our bodies. But that's also an adult decision to make when it comes to alcohol and tobacco, right? So you've got right liberalism with Hoppe, and then I would also argue that the founding fathers in many cases were right liberals as well. They wanted liberalism, but liberalism was much more about get off my back so I can get out there and live the Christian life the best way I know how. I don't really have a problem with that. I think that that's pretty good. I sympathize with it, as a matter of fact. I don't really call myself a libertarian, but if you're a right libertarian, some contemporary examples of this would be Tom Woods, Lou Rockwell, to an extent Dave Smith, even though he's not Christian, he's Jewish. Napolitano, Andrew Napolitano, he's a Catholic libertarian. There's several people that just Larry Bean, he's a Lutheran. There's several people who live out there who just want the government out of their lives so they can live a peaceful life, and they want government to be as small as possible so they can live peaceably among men and be good, morally good people. And that's great. God bless those folk. I sympathize with them. I think that they have some interesting arguments for how government gets in the way. I do. I would argue that we've got to use power to actually shrink the government, and to just tie this to modernity, what's going on in modern times right now, as I sit here on the 25th of February of 2025, which over the next few days I'm going to be recording this, so it's actually going to come out much later than that. Excuse me while I silence my phone. I think that it's important to recall that to call to mind that these people are different than us, but they're nevertheless friends. And so, yeah, I want to draw that distinction between two kinds of liberalism. The other thing that I think it's important to speak about is the aforementioned neo-reactionary trichotomy. This is kind of what I'm talking about. You've got the more techno-commercialists, theonomists, and then nationalists. And I've said before, I've had this discussion with an RX enthusiast, formerly known as American neo-reactionary, that I really see a lot of benefit in all three. I would say ideally the techno-commercialists are the kind of people that build big businesses and fund the theonomists and the nationalists. And the other thing that I've mentioned, like I said, this is a trichotomy where you've kind of got in the middle. All three of these are neo-reactionary or maybe just big brand and reactionary. techno-capitalism or techno-commercialism is the other term for it, and then nationalism, and then the more traditionalists, the theonomists. And I see value in all three. Again, ideally, the capitalists fund everybody else, but then I do think we should have tradition, patriarchy, virtue upheld. In the case of the theonomists, I think that's important. But I'm also, I think to my core, there's a part of me that's nationalist. I do really think that caring about our borders and stopping the expansion of our borders through war, and kicking out people from this country that don't belong here, foreigners, is really important. We need that badly. That's something we need sorely. And so I wanted to say that first, but let's now go into more. So as I've mentioned, the reactionaries are for tradition, order being upheld, and in many cases monarchy. And why is this? Well, let me read just a little bit of this book. It's kind of like an introduction. I'm going to be reading this book quite a bit, but I want to begin with this should be on page 9 is where we're going to start, of The Reactionary Mind by Michael Warren Davis. Let's see here. Imagine a land where the average citizen lives on about 12 acres of land, and the poorest of the poor get by with just one. None of them have ever seen the road darkened by a skyscraper or heard the air split by the sound of a passing airplane. Nearly 100% of the population lives and works in the great outdoors. Their skin is a healthy bronze, their hands are strong and calloused, their muscles are hard, taut, and eminently practical, earned through long days of wholesome labor. There are no pesticides or growth hormones in this country. All the meat and vegetables they eat are totally organic. Their furniture is what we would call antique, fashioned by master craftsmen in the local style and passed down from father to son over generations. To heat their homes, they burn wood in the fireplace. Of course, they chop the wood themselves. Here, nothing is disposable and nothing need be. When a man's trousers catch a nail, his wife can darn the tear in a matter of minutes. In fact, she herself made the trousers from wool her husband sheared from his own sheep. If a chair breaks, her husband fells a tree and carves a new one. Tinkering at these pleasant little chores under the shade of an oak tree might even be the definition of happiness. For the most part, these folks walk everywhere they need to go. It keeps them fit and limber. Besides, they're never far from town. Everything they need is at most a few miles from the front door. Not one of them has ever seen a thoroughway or a byway, and no tractor trailer has ever disturbed the quiet of this little domain. The only sounds a man hears are the whistle of the scythe as his son mows the barley, the low of the heifer as she brushes away flies with her tail, and the voice of his wife calling him in for lunch. Of course, the routine changes slightly as the year goes on. Life here is tied to the seasons. In spring, the men stay up all night drinking craft beer, roasting pigs and lambs for the Easter feast. This they'll eat with apples and plums and wild strawberries. The boys will crown the girls with garlands of wildflowers and woo them with memorized poetry. Broods of children will chase rabbits through the briar. Someone will play the guitar and people will dance. Come autumn, the men will hunt deer and geese. The harvest feast will be marked with hearty vegetable stews, tart cider or warm brandy, and all sorts of homemade cheeses. The men will build a great bonfire, the people will sing and dance, and when the celebration ends, families will walk home to their cottages. There's perfect silence over the valley. An owl hoots somewhere deep in the forest, a badger chitters in the brush. Here there are no street lamps or strip malls. Once the sun sets, all is dark. Every living thing looks up and sees the same pale moon looming amid a crowd of stars. The road ahead is lit by these heavenly bodies. How could it be otherwise? Welcome to a day in the life of a serf. That's a slightly romanticized view, but only slightly. Our view of the Middle Ages has been clouded by centuries of bad history piled on top of one another. So before we go any further, we must clear up 3 common misconceptions about our friend the serf. 1. The serf was oppressed. The defining characteristic of serfdom, it would seem, is a total lack of freedom. But what do we mean by freedom? Usually we mean exactly what the Marquis de Sade would claim, the ability to exercise one's agency to fulfill one's desire. The modern would probably say freedom is the ability to, quote, live your best life, end quote. Freedom then is about choices. The more our choices align with our desire, the freer we think ourselves to be. For instance, the citizen of a communist country gets his bread by standing in a bread line. Everyone receives the same crusty loaf with the same bland wrapper. They have no choice. They are not free. The citizen of a capitalist country, meanwhile, goes to the grocery store. Does he want Wonder Bread, Pepperidge Farm, Nature's Own, Sara Lee, Arnold, or store brand? Does he prefer white, wheat, rye, pumpernickel, cinnamon raisin, sprouted grain, gluten-free? He has choices. He is free. Theoretically, this would mean that the man who shops at the largest store is the freest. That's what we mean when we say that a store has the best selection in town, that it has the most options to choose from. But if freedom is defined as the ability to choose from as many options as possible, then freedom is automatically defined by income. In theory, I can walk to Market Basket and choose from hundreds of different breads, the cheapest of which costs $1.99. Yet if I have only $2 in my pocket, I have only one choice, which is literally, really, no choice at all. If I have only $1 in my pocket, then I have less freedom than our comrade in the bread line, who at least gets some bread. This isn't an apologetic for communism, of course, but maybe we can see how our definition of freedom is a bit muddled. What's more, chains like Trader Joe's and Aldi are quickly building a supermarket empire by taking away choice. They realize that Americans like choice in theory but hate it in practice. We're highly susceptible to option paralysis. While we'd be perfectly content eating away of the hundreds of breads in a baked good aisle, having to pick just one causes us mental anguish. We're actually glad when someone makes such decisions for us. This is the case with so much of modern America. We have more choices than we have desires. In fact, there's a whole segment of the economy devoted to creating desire for products that already exist but nobody ever wanted. It's called advertising. In a sane economy, supply responds to demand. In America's capitalist economy, we create the supply and then manufacture the demand. Nobody wants a Chia Pet or an iPhone until someone offered to sell it to them for a reasonable price. Anyway, what's a reasonable price for something you don't want and don't need? So we can't say that the serf was oppressed merely because he lacked choices. In fact, I would argue that he was freer because he was free from meaningless choices. If he wanted bread, he baked it. And this goes well beyond economics. We feel not only entitled to our infinite choices, but obligated to make them with the utmost care. There are 8 billion people on Earth, and we have to find the perfect one to marry. There are more than 26,000 colleges on the planet, and we have to attend the one that's just the right fit for us. Then we have to move to our ideal city and land our dream job, which will allow us to buy our dream car and go on our dream vacation to an island paradise in the Caribbean. If we don't, we'll die, unhappy and unfulfilled. This is nonsense, of course, but many Americans think this way, even if unconsciously, and it's making us miserable. We are always free to choose, but never free from choice. We lack the greatest freedom of all, freedom from desire, otherwise known as gratitude. Chesterton once said that thanks is the highest form of thought, and gratitude is happiness doubled by wonder. This has always been the position taken by the Catholic Church. Christian serfs were warned against greed and urged to thank God for what little they had. Most of our contemporaries would probably call that a form of propaganda meant to defend the lairds from their envious peasants. Well, the American middle class enjoys prosperity beyond anything the fattest, richest laird in all the Middle Ages could have dreamt of. We have infinitely more to be grateful for, and yet we're infinitely less grateful for it. Gratitude for the blessings of his life is what made the serf's lot such a happy one. He lived his whole life in the village where he was born. He began apprenticing for the family business as soon as he was old enough to hold a shovel or carry a hammer. He married some girl he'd known and befriended since childhood. He was baptized, confirmed, married, and buried in the same church he attended every Sunday. In other words, he was blissfully free from all the basically meaningless choices that we moderns spend the first 50 years of our lives agonizing over. By the time he was 18, he could get on with living. Myth number 2. The serf was ignorant. When we picture a serf in our mind's eye, we see an illiterate, superstitious bigot, his boots caked with manure and his face full of warts. He couldn't read, he couldn't vote. If he wanted music, he had to sing it himself. If he wanted art, he had to content himself with the statues in his parish church. He was uncultured and uncouth, trapped in a religious political system which he had no say, and which he couldn't understand even if he did. How unlike us moderns, we spend our days reading Plato and listening to Beethoven. For long hours, we wander through museums or else simply plant ourselves beneath an oak tree and contemplate the unity of all creation. I can't say it without laughing. On Fridays, we gather with our friends for our weekly symposium. We drink wine and discuss Confucius and Augustine and Al-Ghazali. And we're all very proud of those wise, benevolent elected officials we send to Washington. It's amusing to consider how many wars were fought to empty a little scripture out of the peasant's head and fill it with a bunch of sitcoms and pornography. I'm going to read that again, louder for the people in the back. It's amusing to consider how many wars were fought to empty a little scripture out of the peasant's head and fill it with a bunch of sitcoms and pornography. It's doubly amusing to read the accounts of men who thought the future might develop otherwise. The philosophes believed the revolution would bring about a grand republic of letters, governed by a mass of learned and virtuous citizens guided by pure reason. Friedrich Engels believed that in a communist society, the proletariat would become like his bourgeois friends. They would drink champagne, eat caviar, and fox hunt. It never occurred to these men that most people might not want to be lettered. They might not have much interest in the fancy things afforded by Engels' trust fund. To be fair, this isn't a uniquely modern error. It has its origins at the very beginning of philosophy. In the first line of his Metaphysics, Aristotle declares, "All men by nature desire to know." It's a nice sentiment, but a false one. Let me prove it to you. In your pocket, there's a little black box. Using that little black box, you can read every known work of Seneca, Euclid, Xenophon, Aquinas, Pascal, Shakespeare, Milton, Montaigne, Donne, Johnson, and Dickens. But you probably won't. You'll use it to look at pictures of strange-looking cats and watch videos of men hitting each other in the groin. And that's not your fault. Human beings on the main simply aren't very curious. This is the confounding thing about the Enlightenment. It's true that all men are, to some degree, rational, but it's also true that all men are, to some degree, creative. We are all, to some degree, funny. Why on earth should we single out reason as the basis of our society? The idea of a republic of letters is only slightly less ridiculous than that of a republic of paintings or a republic of comedies. I say slightly less because every human being possesses a rational soul. We are defined by reason in a way we aren't defined by creativity or humor. But assuming that men will make good use of their rational souls is a pretty big gamble, and so far it hasn't paid off. That's the trouble with our political, economic, and cultural institutions. They were devised by men who, like Aristotle, believed that every man could be a philosopher and assumed that every man wanted to be one. The feudal order was built on the opposite assumption. The medievals assumed that most men didn't want to be philosophers. They were content to be men. Myth number 3. The serf was miserable. I suppose if we went back in time, we could pull a few thousand serfs and find out what percent of them were miserable. Then we could compare that data to modern statistics. That would settle the question definitely. I'm sorry, I misread that. That would settle the question definitively. How are we doing in 21st century America? According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, about 10% of Americans have medical records that list them as clinically depressed. In 2017, a Harris poll reported that 72% of Americans feel persistently lonely. In 2019, YouGov found that 1 in 5 millennials claim to have no friends at all. It's hard to believe that our peasant friends could have had worse numbers. Many conservatives would balk at the idea of judging our social order based on happiness, but every question about humanity must concern itself with happiness. It's the whole reason for our existence. This is one of the fundamental truths of the Christian religion. The Baltimore Catechism, in its sweet and simple way, puts it thus: why did God make you? God made me to know him, to love him, and to serve him in this world, and to be happy with him forever in heaven. Now that last clause is certainly important. Trying to make everyone as happy on earth as in heaven is to immortalize the eschaton, as conservative highbrows like to say. It's the very essence of utopian thinking, and the reactionary is even more allergic to utopianism than the conservative. Yet the fact remains that humans are meant for happiness in a deep and metaphysical sense. Men are made to be happy. The founding fathers understood this and had the wisdom to enshrine the pursuit of happiness on our republic's birth certificate. Back when he was a conservative, the columnist George F. Will wrote a book called The Pursuit of Virtue and Other Tory Notions. Yet Mr. Will missed the point, perhaps because he's an atheist. The pursuit of happiness is the Toryist notion of all. Virtue is certainly a necessary aspect of human happiness. A man can't really be happy as he wallows in sin. Whatever debased pleasure he might feel, it's not worthy of the name happiness. The pursuit of happiness was the center of the medieval worldview. They understood, as every Christian does, that we cannot be happy without God, that God is our happiness. Our hearts are restless, Lord, until they rest in Thee, as St. Augustine said. There's no better word for the condition of modern man. Restless. He is oppressed by his own false freedom, tortured by his inflamed appetites, and humiliated by his own ignorance. The things that might make him truly happy, gratitude and simplicity, peace and quiet, are kept forever out of his reach. Whatever else we want to say about the Middle Ages, that certainly wasn't true of the happy serf, whose gratitude and simplicity were a matter of faith and routine. Such happiness was not only independent of wealth, but it could be found in poverty. Gratitude was something that could be felt even after the collapse of a civilization. St. Augustine witnessed firsthand the fall of the Roman Empire, the event that inaugurated the so-called Dark Ages, otherwise known as the Early Middle Ages. This was a turning point in the history of Christianity, as Charles Van Doren, himself no reactionary, wrote, "Where wealth had been the measure of a Roman, now poverty became the measure of a Christian." It was poverty, yes. Specifically, it was Lady Poverty, the maiden in the desert who won the heart of that great chevalier, St. Francis of Assisi. In his blessed poverty, the medieval man found a reflection of Christ himself, the poor carpenter's son, and the source of all true happiness. Excuse me. As Van Doren observed, the Christian of the Dark Ages also felt that the greatest of human pleasures was to praise the Creator. Simple meals, a simple life, time to contemplate eternity, and a voice free to praise God. What more could man want? We cannot remake the world as 12th century France. But what we can do is recognize that a happy society would look much more like 12th century France than 21st century America. If one believes with Louis de Bonald that Christianity is but the application to society of every moral truth, end quote, then one would want our society to be in some meaningful way Christian. In the Middle Ages, we have the singular example of a purely Christian society. It was isolated from the old paganism by the yawning Dark Ages, and not yet spoiled by paganism's return in the 15th century. If we are ever to re-Christianize the West, the result will necessarily look like the Middle Ages, and for the reactionary, that is a happy outcome, because he knows better than anyone that the worship of progress is the worship of a false God. But before we can reclaim that what we've lost, including our easy access to happiness, we must humiliate our pride, our idolization of progress, and give a fair hearing to the ages and the people that have gone before us. And that's just chapter 1. Isn't that beautiful? Wow. Oh my goodness. So yeah, let it be known that is just part of this book. I love it. I'm going to read more of it to you guys, but just contemplate that. Pause this and think for 1 or 2 minutes and then resume. Think about life in the past, how good it was in many ways, and then think about what we're living in right now.